In 1862, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee made a plan to go north and capture a major northern city. This major northern city would be Baltimore or Philadelphia. From there, the railways to Washington, D.C. would be disconnected. This plan went wrong because a Confederate scout dropped the plans on the ground while using the bathroom. These plans were given to Union General McClellan. Because of this, he was able to move troops to resist Lee's advance. All he needed to change was making the Confederate scout not drop their plans on the ground. After making this change, Lee was able to march into the north, and when Union forces tried to intercept him in northern Maryland, he was able to defeat them. At this point, I will mention reasons the Confederates could win the war. The Union had incompetent generals. There was a lot of anti-war sentiment in the North before they won the major battles. The South had vague support from France and Britain. The French because they wanted to colonize Mexico and thought America might drive them out, and the British because they thought a unified America would threaten their position as a world power. Both of their industries were also somewhat dependent on southern cotton. Because of this, if the South won a major victory, the French and British would probably recognize them as an independent nation. And if the Union refused to recognize the South as an independent nation, the British would win the war. Because the Union didn't have a lot of competent generals, I'd assume the Union wouldn't be able to make a very competent defense. I'd also like to mention that if the Confederates lost this battle, it would basically be a repeat of Gettysburg. Gettysburg was another attempt Lee made to advance into the north. Because of this, we will assume the Confederates win the battle. From here, Lee's forces would advance on Baltimore and take the city. He would then seize Washington. At this point, the war in the north would be extremely unpopular, forcing Lincoln to make peace. In this dominant position in peace negotiations, the Confederates would demand Kentucky, parts of Missouri, and Oklahoma. The North would also be forced to pay reparations to pay for the war damages, as well as recognizing the South's independence. In the peace, the North would also be forced to allow slavery in all slave states that didn't secede. After the war, the North's economy would continue to grow at a similar pace in our timeline. The North's economy will only go marginally slower because they would have to pay tariffs for southern cotton. The South would continue to import slaves to keep up with demand, but would eventually run out of space for plantations. This brings us to post-war expansion. In 1862, the French invaded Mexico. This invasion happened during the Civil War because the French thought the Americans would drive them out. In our timeline, after the Civil War, the Americans pressured the French to leave Mexico. During this war, the French really only controlled central Mexico. Because of this, the French would sell the north of Mexico and possibly the Yucatan to the Confederates. In this timeline, the French would also stay in Mexico. After gaining northern Mexico, the South would also seize Cuba and Central America, so that they would have more land to farm. The British would support the invasions of Central America because they thought the Confederates would be better/more efficient farmers than the native Central Americans. By the 1800s, the gap between the North and South's economy and population would grow. The North would have a population 3.5 times the size of the Confederacy, but this would include slaves. Excluding slaves, the North's population would be 5 times the size of the Confederacy. The economy of the South would have hit its golden age in the 1870s, but would start to run out of land for plantations and start to stagnate going into the 1880s. This would mean the South's economy would grow nearly double with all of this new fertile ground, while the North's economy would grow well over triple in the same period due to the rapid industrialization the North went through. The South would industrialize a decent amount, which led to the growth, but not nearly at the same rate or magnitude of the North. In the late 1880s, the gap between the North's and South's population and economy would embolden the North to invade again. In this war, the British, being very dependent on southern cotton for their industries, would back the South. The start of the war would bring a grand northern assault into Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. In this assault, the North would make big gains in Kentucky and Missouri, but fail to make big gains in Virginia. By this point, British troops would start arriving to reinforce the southern lines. The South would then concentrate all of their troops in Virginia because their other fronts were guarded. This would be for a grand assault in Virginia, like the one they had done in the previous war. The northern generals would see this coming, but wouldn't have enough time to prepare. This assault would also have naval support from the British, who would make small landings across the coast. All of this combined would cause the same old plan to succeed. During this offensive, the South wouldn't achieve as much success, but still be able to encircle Washington, D.C. and seize it. During this offensive, the British would also invade New York and Philadelphia. These invasions would be resounding successes, so the North would have to negotiate peace after the war became unpopular. In the peace deal, the South would demand the rest of Missouri, all of Maryland, and the south of Illinois. Along with this, they would be forced to return runaway slaves, along with paying huge war reparations. The British would also get borderlands which would be ceded to Canada. This peace would leave the North completely humiliated. After this victory in the Second Civil War, the South's economy would greatly expand. This is because the South would have more land to build plantations, and they would also use the to huge war reparations to fund their further industrialization. Throughout the 1890s, the South's economy would catch up to the North's, and by 1900, the North's economy would be 1.5 times bigger than the South's. In the 1890s, the South would also set ultimatums to Colombia and Venezuela to get some land for agriculture. They would refuse these ultimatums, so the South would go to war with them. This fighting would be tough because of the jungle terrain, but the South would eventually come out dominant. In the peace, the South would pay $100 million to Venezuela and Colombia for these lands. Confederate diplomacy. The South would continue to export large amounts of cotton to Western Europe. The British and French would be the largest importers of this cotton. This would mean the South would have essentially had an alliance with the British and French because of how much the southern cotton fueled their economy. Besides this, the South would also have a lot of influence in South America, where slavery would still be around in Brazil. Union diplomacy. The Union would, at the dawn of the 20th century, heavily resent the South and all of their allies. This would mean that the Union would get closer to the Central Powers. It would especially get closer to the Germans. The Union would also continue to get increasingly radical as the South had humiliated them. Unforeseen consequences. In this universe, there would probably be something along the lines of the scramble of China. This would be because the Union wouldn't be nearly as strong, so when historically they backed no partition of China, in this universe they wouldn't be as powerful or influential, so there's a good chance this happened. The purchase of Alaska also never happens in this time. World War I. In the war, the South would back the Entente, which would mean the North would side with the Central Powers. The South would join the war in 1915 after they were able to get public support. In Europe, the Central Powers would be pushed back a little bit more than they were historically. This would be on all fronts. In 1916, the North would join the war. This would be after the North became a dictatorship, which happened after they became a lot more radical. This would finally tip over in 1916 when they became a dictatorship. At the beginning of 1916, the Central Powers' morale would be at a low, but the North joining would boost morale. The North would still have a lot of people and a marginally larger economy. This would mean once the North joined, they would immediately make big gains on all fronts. This would also be because a majority of Confederate troops would be in Europe. The South would start shipping troops back to North America, but it would be too late. Richmond would fall in the winter of 1916. This would see the Entente's war effort completely flipped on its side. This would lead to a peace being signed in the beginning of 1917, the peace in North America. In the peace, the Union would demand Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, the south of Illinois, Northern Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Texas, along with the South returning all lands to Colombia and Venezuela. They would also regain all lands taken by the British in the previous war. On top of this, the Union would be forced to give independence to a unified Central American state. The Union would also demand an end to slavery in the South and enormous war reparations. That's all. Hope you enjoyed. Like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me against the YouTube algorithm.